Hi, I'm James Williams, and welcome back to my channel. So you might have received, like me, a few emails like this from Microsoft recently, which explain that certain flows that use the HTTP trigger in Power Automate have a new trigger URL. So if you click the button to go to the flow and examine the trigger properties, you might see that there's a new URL in this box, which looks a bit like this, which you'll have to use because by the 30th of November 2025, like it says here, any old versions of the URL that you had will stop working. So the old format's being deprecated. So anywhere that you use the URL to trigger your flow will have to be updated to use the new URL format. So that's one issue. You'll have to make that change, otherwise the flows won't work. But actually there's another issue which I'll explain in this video. So the other issue is that the trigger is no longer reporting the query strings that we used in the URL. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to create a new flow here, which is going to be called HTTP query string demo. And I'm going to use the when an HTTP request is received trigger. So I'll click that, click create. Here's my new flow. And all I'm going to do in this very, very simple demonstration is to add a response. So using the same connector, the HTTP request connector, I'm going to use the response action. So where I use the URL from the trigger here, which will be generated after I've clicked save, and I'm actually going to change this so that anyone can use it. And I'm going to make sure that the method for the URL is a get, which means we can just open it in a browser and it will work. All I'm going to do in this response, in the body of the response, which is what will appear on the page if I'm looking at the URL in a browser, is I'm going to put in from dynamic content this queries expression here. So you can see that's trigger outputs and the queries property of the trigger outputs. So that means if I use a query string to add some properties to my URL before submitting it, then this should show me what not only the query names are, but also the values. If I just click save there, what should happen then is once it's saved in the trigger, I've been given a URL. So I can click copy, and I can go into a web page here and paste that in. If I press enter, what should happen for this flow is if I just go back to the run history, you'll see that me pressing enter there to fire the URL into the browser has triggered the flow. And if I look at the run, I didn't put any query strings on there. So in the response, we had the status code 200, but there was no other material returned to the page, which is why this page was blank. So a query string is when you get to the end of the normal part of a URL, which looks like this in this demonstration. There's then a question mark. So Microsoft are using it themselves for Power Automate to work properly. So there's various properties here like API version. They've said that that equals 1. And then another query string value here is added by having an ampersand character. And the next one's called SP, and the value of that is everything up to the next and so on. So they're all the built-in ones. And this signature is what authenticates, even though anyone can run the URL, this bit needs to be correct in order for it to work. But I can have my own after here. So if I put another query at the end, so I'll use the and character, and then I'll just say hello equals world. So now if I press enter, that query's gone off to the flow, and I would have expected to see it come back here, but in fact the page is still blank. And if I go to this new run, we can see that in the output of the trigger, there's nothing here to indicate that there was any additional queries. And the only place we can see that I actually tried to put a query string on the end of the URL was in this property, external URI. Right at the end here, you'll see that my and hello world is there, but there's nothing in the trigger outputs that I can use to read that query very easily. And that did happen with the old format of the URL, which I'll demonstrate next. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to need to get the old URL, and as this was a brand new flow, I don't actually have it. But you can still access the old format of the URL, which will work until November the 30th. And this might be useful if you've updated your target environment to use the new URL, then discovered something didn't work. Let's say you've not kept a record of what the old URL was. This will help you recover it. So the way to do that is if I open up the developer tools, I'm just pressing F12 there, and I'll click Open Dev Tools, and I go to this Network tab. This is now recording everything that happens in my browser. So if I click Edit, you can see it's loaded all the information about the flow. And one of those requests to Power Automate there was called list callback URL. So I have a look at this request. We can see that we don't need to record anymore, so I'll just turn that off. We can see that the response here included the new version of the URL to the flow. But in the payload that went off to this endpoint, there was a property called show deprecated callback URL, and that says false. So if I right click that and change this in edit and resend, at the bottom here, I can actually change that query. So here's the query that's getting sent off. Here's show deprecated callback URL. So if I just change this from false to true and click send again, you'll see in the new response, I've got the old version of the URL. So I'll copy that out here, and then in another tab, I'll paste that in. And at the end, I'm going to add my own query string again. So that will be and hello equals world. And if I send that off, we can now see that the page has returned my query, the name of the query string, which is hello, and the value, which is world. And if I go into the flow runs again, I can close this down now because we don't need it anymore. We'll see that that latest run in the trigger outputs does have this queries property. And actually it looks a lot shorter than the previous one did. So and that external URI property isn't there either. So there's quite a lot of difference between the outputs of the query of the trigger, depending which format of the URL that was used. But the important one for our purposes is that those query strings that used to appear in the old format of the URL don't appear in the new format, which is a problem. So the method I'm going to use to fix this is to use a variable. And the reason I'm doing this is the technique will allow us to use both possible versions of the URL and then use that variable to access the properties, whether or not we've used the old version of the URL or the new version of the URL. Or in fact, if the new version of the URL ever gets fixed, if this is just a bug that Microsoft will realize and fix at some point, then we'll just want to use the proper version of the queries. If not, we're going to parse that external URI manually, which is a bit messy, and extract the values ourselves from that. And that's what we'll put in the variable. And then in the rest of our flow, we can just access that variable like we did the existing queries part of the trigger outputs. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add that variable in. So we'll initialize it so that it exists. Just call it queries to match the trigger output. And we want a type of object here. So it's going to have properties, and those properties will have values. And to begin with, we just want this to be an empty object. So a closing, an opening and a closing curly bracket. The next thing we're going to do is add a condition. And this is what we're going to do to check whether in the trigger outputs we've got queries already. So here I'm just going to use an expression null, So if the output of the triggers queries object is null, we go one way, and if it's not equal to null, then we'll go the other way. So just put that dynamic content queries in there. So if there is something in queries, null won't be equal to the output of the queries there, so we'll go down the true branch. So this is where we've got, like with the old URL format, some value for the query. So I'll add in this line, looking at variables again, I'm going to set that variable, the queries variable, and I'll just set it to the queries output of the trigger, and then my job's done. So in my response, rather than queries like this one, I'm going to replace that with my queries variable. So we'll just do a quick test by saving that. And then I'll use that most recent trigger where we did have a query value. We'll see now that we went down this route because we know the trigger output did include the queries. So we've gone down the true branch here. We've set the variable, and in the outputs we can see that I've got my hello world that's come through, and if it had been triggered through a browser, the response that would have gone back would have been that object, the hello world. So that's the true branch. So what we still need to do is the logic to extract the query values from the URL that was used manually if we don't have that available from the trigger outputs. So here I am, having already attempted this. So now we've got the select object is the first action I've used, and into that select I'm splitting on the on that property we found earlier from the trigger outputs. So it's trigger outputs headers, and then this property name that ends in external URI. So we know that at the end of that is all our query string in its kind of raw form. We're passing that into this URI query expression, and what that does, like it says here, it returns the query from a URI. So that basically will strip out anything after the where has it gone? There we are, the question mark, and it will return everything from that point onwards. So the question mark included, it will go right to the end. So that will return just that part of the URL, and then we're going to use the decode URI component function, which you can see here, decodes the input string. So what you might have in a URL, and I've just changed my example here slightly, is that hello world, if we had that as the value of the query string, might have a %20 in it instead of a space. So if I just put a space in here and press enter, the browser will actually rewrite that itself to a URL safe character, which is encoded in this format. So that's actually a space, and that might be what's sent to the flow. So if I go into the flow, what we're doing here is decoding that, so that will become a space again if that's what was sent through. And then what we're doing, having got that whole query string, is we're going to split it, so break it up into chunks around the ampersand character. So every time we've got an and like this, will be a break. So there'll be a break between these two. So that means we'll get one item in an array here, which is a query SV equals 1.0. So that'll be one query string that was sent in to the flow. So we'll have as many things in this array, items in this array, as we do queries in the query string. So that's what goes into the select, and then out of it we want to be able to have the key name here and the property, the value of the key out here. So for the key name, we're just going to take the new item, which is in my example, original example, hello equals world. We're going to split it on the equals. So that will give us just, if we use the first output of that resulting array will just get hello, whereas the last part of that array would be world, and that's what we're going to see in the value part here. So we're going to same expression, but we've got last instead of first, so that will give me world if my query string was hello equals world. But we're also going to do a quick check here to make sure that we actually have more than one item in the array that comes out of split, because if we don't, then this will just give us the same value. So if there wasn't an equals, we're just going to have a blank string coming out of this as the result, rather than the name of the key again, because last would, if it was just hello after an ampersand character, we'd have hello equals hello as the result, when that actually wasn't the case. So that's the expressions I've used in the select, and then from that select, what we're going to do is convert that using this. If I make this a bit bigger, make this array that comes out of select. I can't make that any bigger, sadly. The array that comes out of select is an array of objects, each with a single property. So one of those will be hello, an object with a property called hello, and the value will be world. But we don't want an array, because that wasn't what originally came into the trigger outputs queries property. It was an object. So for every query in the query string, we want a property, and we want a value with that, but we don't want an array of those. We just want it in one big object. So what we're doing here is we're taking the output of the select and we're turning it into a string. So that gives us a representation in JSON of the array, which starts with an opening square bracket and ends with a closing square bracket. So with this substring, which starting from character 1, which is actually after character 1, so we're cutting off the first square bracket and going all the way to the end, except for the closing square bracket. What we're doing then is we're just getting a whole load of objects, and we're going to do a replace on that resulting string. So we're going to get rid of all the closing curly brackets around those objects and the opening curly brackets. Obviously all those are divided by the comma that used to divide the items in the array, and then we're just going to get rid of those curly brackets, so only the commas will remain. Because it's this string we're searching for, that won't affect the very first object's opening square bracket and the very last object's closing square bracket. So it actually leaves us with the format that we want in JSON for one big object full of properties. So the last thing we do is we wrap that in the JSON expression, which will turn our new string into a native object within Power Automate that we can use. And that's what we're setting the value of the queries variable, object variable to. So that's the flow. Let's save it and give it a test. So here's my original, well, my slightly amended query. Now I've got hello equals hello world. I'll run that again, and we can see now that we're getting all the possible values that were sent in to the query string, including those ones sent by Microsoft. So this is telling me that the one I've actually fired off here is the new format URL, because in the old format we didn't get Microsoft's built-in queries, we just got our custom one. So you can see that it's worked for the new URL format. If I just take my slightly amended query at the end and do it on the old format, where previously the result was hello world, press enter there. Now we've got the new version. Hello is hello world with that space unencoded. So that's clearly worked. So let's go back and look at the outputs of the flow. So if I first look at the most recent one, which is the old format URL, we can see that it went down the true route, the true branch, and that was because we had queries in the trigger output. Here it is, hello world. And so that's what the variable's been set to, and in my response it's returned the new result. So we expected that one to work, but then this result, this is where we use the new format URL, but there's nothing in the trigger about the query, So instead, we've gone down the false branch, and we can see that here in the output of the select, the body of that is this array. So we start with an opening square bracket. We've got a closing square bracket there. This has formatted it nicely, but essentially between all those objects, we've got this curly bracket, comma, and new curly bracket. And these are all those individual objects then that make up all the query strings, including the one we've actually sent in. So when we do our replace, we'll get rid of these arrays. We'll get rid of all these intermediate curly brackets. So we'll just be left with this opening one, all the properties, and then the closing square bracket at the end. So if I go into set variable, this is what it looks like. So we've got the opening curly bracket, the closing curly bracket, and all those properties in between. And that's what's been set to the variable. So in the response, we have got the one we want. We've also got the Microsoft ones built in as well. So the other thing you might have done is use the trigger condition previously. So in this example, for my hello query in the query string, I might only want to accept certain values. So in this case, the condition is that this array which I've created here, which includes the text world and hello space world, which are the two examples I've used so far, does that array contain what's actually been used in the trigger output? So if I use anything else, the flow won't run. So I'll demonstrate that with the old URL here. I'll just refresh that. That's the hello world version. If I change it to hello, nothing happens. The flow is not actually running. But if I change that to world, the flow will run and I'll see hello world. So I obviously can't use this condition anymore because that trigger outputs queries property doesn't exist with the new format. So we need a new way of evaluating that. So I've got that same query here in a compose. So what we need to do is not only check for this, but also if this property doesn't exist, try and parse the URL for it manually. And the condition I've come up with here is this one. So again, quite long. I'll make this as large as I can, and I'll scroll down slowly. So you can see it starts very similarly. We've got contains and then the array we want to check for. And then we're using coalesce. So that will use the query from before. If it's there, that means we're using the old format, or Microsoft to fix the bug if that time comes. If not, then we're using this expression, which is similar to the other approach. And that will come up with, sorry, it ends at this brown bracket here. So this expression, which looks at the external URI used. Again, we're using URI query. We've just done a bit of work here to make sure that it exists. If we're using the old format URL, this property doesn't exist, so we'll get a null back. So we're just putting any old URL in here. Otherwise, the URI query expression will fail. We're then decoding it again, and we're splitting it this time on the opening for the query we're actually wanting to check. So in this case, it's hello and equals. So that'll give us, if it's there, an array of 2 items. Everything before hello equals in the URL in the query string, and then after that, everything after it. We're then getting the last of those 2 items, which will give us the part after hello equals, and we're splitting again, and this time it's on the ampersand character, the and character, and that's because we only want to go up to the next and, if there is one, or to the end of the string, because we don't want any other query strings to be involved. And we're getting the first result from that. So this, in theory, should give us the same value for this one particular query in the query string. So if we haven't got the output of trigger outputs queries, we're doing it the hard way. So if I just go back and look at the latest result, this is when I tested it with hello equals world. So you can see that the old trigger was true because this was using the old format. And this new combined one is obviously also true again, and that's because it didn't get anywhere past the first part of the coalesce. But this time I'm going to run it in, before I do I need to actually update the trigger condition. So I'm going to take this expression and I'm going to replace the trigger condition with it. So we need that initial @ sign in, and then I'm going to paste in my condition here. So it looks a bit strange, but that should work. If I just save that now, I'll go to my new format URL and I'll do a refresh because I've already got hello world, which is one of the valid options, and that's worked. If I go back and change it to hello, we should get nothing because that's not one of the allowed values. And then finally, again, we'll put world on the end, and that's working again. So we can see that that new condition's working. So if we go and look at the results, you can see that the old trigger in this case, the output was false. So we know that we're using the new trigger now. We expected that because we don't have the queries in the trigger, but we do have this external URI one which ends with our query string, and in the new condition that's evaluated to true because we've manually gone through and checked that that condition was right. So there we go. That's worked for both reading the query string into that variable and for use in a trigger condition, which is often very useful when you're using the HTTP trigger in Power Automate. So all that leaves for me to say is thank you so much for watching. Please Microsoft fix the bug if you think it is one. I certainly do. If you've liked this video, please consider subscribing to my channel, and I'll see you later, Automator.